I'm so delighted to once again be sharing the stage with two very dear friends and colleagues. I've worked with both of them in different capacities and have always found them to be a fount of information and good sense. So let me begin with Venkatesh. Venkatesh, as you all heard, was our ambassador to Russia, and he actually welcomed me there when I went as part of the Prime Minister's advance team. And I still remember, Venkatesh, you took me out for a wonderful meal. And apart from that, whenever I wanted to have any clarification on our relationship with Russia, he was the obvious person to turn to. And as for Raghavan and I also go back a very long way. I think to the 80s probably, Raghavan, when we first met. And Raghavan was Joint Secretary in the Prime Minister's office when I was Joint Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. And if I may say so, we had a very symbiotic relationship because there were a lot of issues to sort out between the two offices. And later on, we interacted again when I was Secretary East in the ministry, though you were away at that time, I think, in the embassies where you served. Both of them have been ambassadors to Russia. And so, given the context of Prime Minister's recent visit to Russia, and also, as you heard, the title of the session today is The World in Flux. So we hope to place this relationship within the context of a world in flux. So without further ado, let me turn to my questions. My very first question is, we're talking about a world in flux. Why is the world in flux? How is the world in flux? What are the solutions? And what is India's role? So if I could ask each of you to comment on that. Raghavan, you first.
Thank you.
Mike, please. Otherwise it doesn't get recorded, it's on.
Well, so thanks Lata for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me to join you here. Very happy to be with my good friend Venkatesh Verma. The question you've asked, why is the world in flux? My answer is because we don't have a world order.
Okay.
We had a world order of sorts during the Cold War when the world was divided in a fairly predictable manner between the so-called free world and the so-called communist world. And there was this group of us hanging around in the non-aligned movement trying to find some space for ourselves between these two blocks. What happened after the Cold War was that the world stopped thinking it needed to restructure the order after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the resultant unipolar world. But also, when the Cold War collapse ended, countries became free to reach out across the divide that had been created by the Cold War between the two blocks. Globalization, the trade movements in trade, technology, the information technologies that also came up in the late 90s, early 2000s. What it meant really was that countries were able to reach across borders, the free movement of money, of ideas, of technologies. And what it meant was a number of countries were able to leapfrog stages of development. And you ended up with what you have today, a whole range of small, medium, and big powers who have acquired a certain amount of economic clout, military clout, regional influence, and who all believe that their own interests have to be accommodated in any world order that comes out. So what you have is people jostling for power and influence in individual areas and feeling quite rightly that their interests should be taken into account when whatever you call a world order is created. That's where we are today. And that is the flux that you are seeing today. And if you're looking at, for example, the war in Ukraine, it is because there was a security architecture in place during the Cold War, which collapsed, and there was no effort to create a relevant European security architecture for the post-Cold War era. Same thing is happening in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. So that's where we are. And well, Gaza is another example also of a development because the world order is broken down.
And Venkat, what about you?
Ma'am, first of all, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. One detail was missed out. Both Ambassador Raghavan and Ambassador Vijay Reddy were my bosses at some stage in my career. So if both my bosses refer to me as friends, I think it's it's a very warming sort of sentiment that great to be in Bangalore, great to be at the BIC. Delighted that some of our senior colleagues are here, but also a lot of interest in international affairs and amongst the young people, which is great. I completely agree with Ambassador Raghavan. I mean, the world order is not a given. I mean, God doesn't give you world order. World orders are made largely by major powers in their own interests. It reflects their own priorities and how they want to structure the world. And the success that they have in structuring the world as a whole is, in fact, an attribute of their great power status. So obviously we are in a process of transition. I think the transition is going from what was familiar and predictable at a certain stage of time, not necessarily equal or equitable or effective, but predictable. And somehow we tend to equate predictability with a certain comfort level. But if predictability goes, I mean, it's not that we didn't have wars in the Cold War period. I mean, it was people said it was stable. It was stable between the two superpowers, the Soviets and the Americans. But if you ask the Koreans or the Afghans or the Vietnamese or large parts of Africa, we went through a lot of conflict. I mean, the Cold War also was. So I would say the transitional period that we are living in can be characterized by 4 or 5 attributes. First is that there is now a heightened sense of confrontation between the big powers. I mean, the Russians and the Americans are now in direct confrontation, most visibly through Ukraine, but they are in confrontation in other aspects as well. And Ambassador Raghavan referred to the breakdown of the established security order in Europe. And it will be reformed again after the Ukraine war plays out itself. All wars come to an end at some stage. And Russia will have to be part of a new European order, but we'll see how it comes about. The second is the rise of China, which is, of course, a big, gigantic event in this century, both in terms of economic, technological, military power. It's no longer a regional power, which we understood for a long time. It's now a regional power with very strong global impact. The third is that there is a diffusion of economic growth. 30, 40 years ago, large parts of the developing world were still developing, but there are large parts of the developing world which are quite substantially powerful in economic terms. Southeast Asia, for example, is doing very well. South Asia, India is now the 5th largest economy in the world, will soon become the 3rd largest economy. Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, until now, recently, are good economic success stories. The Middle East is coming to its own. They're no longer under the shadow of the United States. The Saudis and the UAE, and they have views on world affairs. They want to join BRICS. They have joined BRICS. So there is that amount of diffusion also taking place. South Africa and Brazil, and that is the third attribute. The fourth attribute is the diffusion of technology. And technology has a cascading effect on established structures. It creates new structures, creates new concentrations of power. But obviously, technology is a big driver of, and we are in the midst, probably not even in the midst. I think we are at the starting stages of the AI technological revolution, which we have gone through the computer revolution from the 80s onwards, and the internet revolution. Now we're getting to the fusion of, and there's also convergence of technologies. But having said this, I think there are also large parts of the world that are becoming ungovernable. There are ungoverned territories in large parts of the world where you have armed groups which don't belong, the non-state armed groups. I mean, some of them are terror groups, which are very influential. You see Hamas or Hezbollah, or not that they are terrorist groups, I wouldn't call them that. But within the state, there are armed groups which are as powerful or more powerful than the state armies themselves. So legitimate violence, which is the monopoly of states, is no longer the monopoly of states anymore. Large swathes of Africa, are with groups which these states themselves don't control. And if you combine this with the fact that technologies are widely available, internet is a great source, is a great connector, but also a great disruptor. So the world is going through a lot of flux. There's a lot of instability, the last point I would say is that the old frameworks, which dealt with and provided stability and predictability to the order that we knew, the order that we grew up in, the United Nations, international law, the WTO, world trade, globalization processes. These are all under either pressure or are being asked to adapt to the new realities. Now, the good story in all this is that we have lived through an international order where really India had a marginal role to play in forming that original order. For example, we were not even an independent state when the nuclear order came about. And we were the subject of a lot of pressures. And going forward, as we go into building up a new order in this transition period, hopefully India is far better placed, and we should have ideas of our own and our interests of our own to take it forward. So I would say that India is now better placed to see how. So we should approach it through a process of confidence rather than one of concern and despair.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting idea. And so what I took away from that is that for the solution is to create a new world order. What form that world order will take is perhaps something in which India could also play a role. Would that be a good takeaway? Yeah.
Ma'am, there are various ways of looking at how orders should be formed. Since Russia is also part of the theme of our discussion today, the Russian Federation is in a rather militant view of how the new order should be formed. They are rather sort of impatient with the previous order, largely on account of the fact that the basis on which that order was built, which is concordat between Russia and the United States and the other big powers, has almost broken down. And the only last remaining fig leaf of connectivity in that old order is the UN and the UN Security Council. Presently, the established powers, the permanent five, do not want change in the Security Council. But at some stage in the future, we should. India has a different interest. We want change, we want multipolarity to emerge, but we want something that would preserve the best in the past and build on that to create a future. I mean, we want a negotiated multipolarity, not a multipolarity that brings about more disorder than order. Now, this is easier said than done. Obviously, order creating abilities are related to your power. We are more powerful than before in many aspects, but we're still not in the big league. The United States of America is what, $27 trillion. China is $19-20 trillion. The EU is about 17-18. We are four. We have some way to go. But the fact is that the more important thing is, do we pursue our order-creating activity in our own selfish interest, national interest, like all big powers do, or do we combine national interest along with a broader vision of how the world should be structured, in the 21st century, which is not just a Western view of the world, but also a view that takes into account the civilizational values of the East and the Orient, So we look for political multipolarity, but we also look for cultural and civilization multipolarity.
Thank you. Since in many ways what we're talking about is also going to be related to the Cold War, can I request that the freezing temperatures be a little adjusted in the hall? Because I think we're all feeling rather left out in the cold over here. But to be serious...
And remember climate change as well.
Climate change too. I don't think we should be having it quite so air-conditioned. Forecasts by analysts prior to the visit by Prime Minister Modi to Russia said that the talks would focus on trade, payment and currency issues, the China-Vladivostok maritime route, and also conclusion of Chennai-Vladivostok maritime route, and also to concluding the RELOS, which is the reciprocal exchange of logistics agreement. Were these forecasts accurate in your opinion? Is that what happened, or were there other issues that were raised? Raghavan, would you like to kick off with that?
Yeah.
Mic, please. I'm going to request you all to speak into the mic, because otherwise you won't be recorded.
Yeah. I would say, what was important about the Prime Minister's visit to Russia? I think it was to establish the point that in this state of geopolitical flux, while there is this very strong Russia-West face-off, India has its own perspectives on relations with Russia. It has interests which are shaped by history, it has interests which are shaped by geography, and of course we And therefore, at a time when everybody is telling you not to touch Putin and not to touch Russia, we have to make the point that we have an independent line. Venkat was talking about, if you are a participant in a world order, you have to have your own interests at heart, and you need to ensure that you protect your interests first before you succumb to pressures to do whatever other people want you to do. Without, in fact, I would say, not before. So I think the main objective of the Prime Minister's visit was this, to make this point, to make the point that the relationship is vibrant, it is important, and it is different for us than it is for you. We did not have the same history with Russia that you, the Europeans, had. We did not have the same issues that the Americans had. During the Cold War, it was the Russians who actually stood by us when you were actually against us. Now, these are historical reasons. There is a legacy. You have a military cooperation because of which 60% of your armed forces equipment is Russian. You have, and now you have economic possibilities which you should take advantage of. That is why we buy Russian oil, because Russian oil is now available to us, and it is available to us at rates which are good for us. So essentially, the point he was making was that our economic interests or our national interests dictate a line towards Russia which is different from what you have and different from what you want us to have. I think that was the main point of this. The others are matters of detail. I mean, these are ongoing initiatives. The Chennai-Vladivostok shipping corridor was actually first thought about in 2019, I think, when Prime Minister went to Vladivostok. We have interest in associating ourselves with the Northern Sea route, with the Russian Arctic, and all of this would have been discussed. Besides, of course, the very important question of Russia-China relations, which is very important for us in various ways. And so I think there was a wide range of discussions, but I think the big picture is the point that was made by the Prime Minister going first bilateral visit after his third term, and first visit, in fact, for a long time. I think these are important things to keep in mind.
Correct. Venkatesh, would you like to add to that?
Ma'am, I agree with what Ambassador Raghavan has said. I think there is a certain solidity about India-Russia relations. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have a lot to talk about. I think the personal rapport and chemistry between the two was very evident. What they have to talk about, I think, is not just bilateral issues. You mentioned some points which were put out in the joint statement. I think there is a determination on both sides that India-Russia relations on the economic dimension have to be restructured and taken forward. And there are a number of ideas on the table, and there is a mutual need to sort of, and the last 2 years during the Ukraine conflict showed that the commonalities can be mutually beneficial, especially in terms of what we got from Russia in terms of discounted oil, which really helped us in this last 2 years. But Russia is also giving us preferential rates for supply of fertilizers to India, which has also been helpful. Now, bilateral relations, of course, are in an international context. And the context, of course, is very clear. Russia is under very severe international sanctions from the United States and Europe. Russia has therefore moved towards the east. It is engaged with China. It is very eager to engage with India towards the south. Russia is also reaching out in the global south, which is our natural constituency where India plays a very major role. And as Ambassador Raghavan said, I think this was a clear indication that India takes its own decisions. We don't mean to use this as a conflict with any other country. I mean, it is, but we will work in our own interests. We can stand on our own feet. We can think for ourselves. And I think the best example of that was the G20 summit where India was able to bring forth a joint statement by consensus that, especially on Ukraine, which was again discussed during Prime Minister's visit in so we have our own view that was put forward. Now, how is this significant for India-Russia relations? I think India-Russia relations are, I think, quite unique because they've lasted almost 70, 80 years. They have lasted 70, 80 years not because they've remained the same. They've lasted 70, 80 years because they've been renewed periodically. That at every stage in the international system, consistent with the international system, we found ways of identifying areas of cooperation which are in mutual interest. And I think the new areas of cooperation that we want to work with Russia, as India grows, India is a $4 trillion economy, as I mentioned. Russia is $2. Russian energy resources, commodities, their high technology areas, agriculture, new connectivity issues, Chennai-Vladivostok is one, the North-South corridor is another. Russia is developing huge energy resources in the Arctic, where the Northern Sea route has opened up. Now, the good thing is that in every major activity, that Russia does internally, India is a welcome partner. And the message I think that Prime Minister has given to our Russian friends, similarly, India is a growing economy. Our stock markets are doing brilliantly. We have high growth rates expected to go into the next decade. Russia is welcome to come to India. There may be difficulties in banking and finance and other issues, but we will sort of sort them out step by step. So the true sign of partnership is that we don't have identical views on everything. I mean, it's not possible in international relations. But there's a constant effort to see how we can find commonalities where both sides have an interest in cooperating. And I think Prime Minister's visit was clearly succeeded in putting down a marker that India and Russia relations are not just a legacy relationship, but a relationship with a very strong future.
Thank you, Venkat. Raghavan, you mentioned this, and it's true. This is the first state visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Russia since 2015. Now, that's a very long gap. It's 9 years. And earlier we were having annual summits, so at least it was every alternate year. Does this have a specific significance? Is this an effort to balance the US-Russia-India relationship? Both Prime Minister Modi and President Putin did meet in between. I don't mean to say that they haven't met at all in the intervening years. They met in 2017, 2018, 2019. That was in Vladivostok when they talked about the Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor. But beyond that, it was, you can say, really a bilateral visit. There was a bilateral element to the visit, but it was not a state visit. Then President Putin has been to India in 2016, 18, and 2020-21. They met at on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, in 2022 as well. So I'm not suggesting that there have been no contacts between them, but making a state visit makes a certain statement in itself. So this is my question, that can we take this, that this is really a very clear signaling to the West that India proposes to follow its own policy of strategic autonomy? Yes.
One clarification. We've had this tradition of annual summits.
Right.
And as far as I can remember, Venkat, correct me if I'm wrong, this annual summits have continued unbroken.
Yeah.
And actually, you see, Prime Minister Modi incidentally told Putin in Moscow that in the last 10 years we've met 17 times.
Correct.
He made that point. Now, we had this summit, of course, in 2015, Prime Minister Modi came to Moscow. 16, as you said, Putin came to India. 17, where was the summit in 17? It was there. We did have a summit in 17. We've had a summit every year. Even if you count the fact that in 2019, PM went to Vladivostok, it was still counted as an annual summit.
Okay.
So the only gap in this came during the COVID time. In 2020, there was no summit.
Yeah.
Then in 21 December, Putin came.
Yeah.
And then, since Russia invaded Ukraine, we didn't have that. I mean, that was a gap after that. So the gap really came in 2020 there was probably, I don't know if there was.
So there was a bilateral interaction. The summit was not.
Summit was not there. So 21 was Putin's visit. And this is the real gap between 21 and 24. that has taken place. So that Putin's was the 21st summit, I think it was, and this one is called the 22nd summit. The traditional annual summit broke only once.
Yeah,
really,
and
other than
also,
COVID.
you know, you're right, because this is the first bilateral visit by Prime Minister Modi since he took over as Prime Minister in this third term. That sends a very definite signal that it's business as usual with Russia. Venkat, anything you'd like to add on this, the sequence of meetings?
Ma'am, the multilateral calendar is so active nowadays.
Yeah.
I mean, in G20, BRICS, SCO, the United Nations, and other meetings, that leaders nowadays have a lot of opportunity to meet. But of course, the bilateral summit itself has its own significance. As Ambassador Raghavan mentioned, there's been an unbroken record until, I think, 2021. After 2021, I think we have now sort of resumed the tradition of annual summits, and Putin has been invited to come to India in 25 next year, and I'm sure this has been restored. Now, there is no parallel we have with other countries, except perhaps with Japan. Japan also we have annual summits. But in the recent past, I think our interactions with the United States, with France, with Germany, have increased in pace. I mean, they're far more frequent than they have been in the past. But the gold standard has always been with Russia.
Thank you. I think that puts it in the correct context. Now, again, you know, dwelling on the same topic, do you see this as a firm signal to Europe and to the US that India will continue to balance its relationship with Russia and exercise strategic autonomy?
Ma'am, I mean, this is of course a point that is made, but truly, I mean, no serious country would have expected that India would do anything else.
Yeah.
It would not come as a surprise either in Europe or the United States.
Yeah.
They may not be happy, but it is not only in the act of going forward and meeting President Putin in Russia, but also the quite independent nature of our own messaging. I mean, we are not repeating anybody else's message, we are giving our own message. And the fact that India-Russia relations go back, many decades, it is essential that. So I don't think it would come as a surprise in any of the capitals. It's.
Yeah, Raghavan? Yeah, please do.
I differ a little with you on this subject. The Europeans really did expect that at some point of time they could actually persuade India to create a distance with Russia. And I think they made, you said no serious country should have expected otherwise. But I think the Europeans did expect otherwise. And, the kind of lectures that we get, and we've been getting these lectures over the years, we've been told suddenly, at every stage you're told that, you're on the wrong side of history. Get onto the right side of history. But history seems to be moving all the time so as we remain on the right side of it. And, this was told to us by the Americans about Iran. We were told to us by the Americans about Iraq, about Syria. And so I think from time to time we do need to establish with these countries that we will do what we want to do and what we have to do. And it is something that I'm very happy that we did it, and we should be continuing to do it. As Venkat said, India has increased in strength, power and influence over the last 2 decades. If today we succumb to pressure, then we have no excuse for ourselves. When we did not succumb at a time when we had much less power to withstand pressure. So I think it's what we should be doing, and others had better get used to it. It's as simple as that.
Thanks. That was very interesting, the 2 points of view. Now, of course, there would have been discussions on Ukraine. How do you think that dialogue went in Russia between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin? What's your own feeling? Would there have been a serious discussion on how the war within Ukraine could be resolved?
Ma'am, here again, I don't think the Russians were surprised by what we said, because you would recall that Prime Minister Modi had said that this is not an era of war in Samarkand.
Yeah.
We have set out our positions in the UN and other forums. Having said this, we were also quite instrumental by sheer doggedness and diplomatic skill to produce a paragraph on Ukraine in the G20 summit, which is the only consensus paragraph that the Americans and Russians have agreed, or the Europeans have agreed in any forum. It's the G20 paragraph on Ukraine, which has several layers. Which is the protection, the importance of peace, number one, the importance of dialogue and diplomacy to resolve issues, the importance of the UN Charter and going forward, but also the fact that there are fundamental interests involved for the countries concerned, and these need to be reconciled at the negotiating table rather than on the battlefield. So maybe our Prime Minister's message may be a little more elaborate and public in Moscow, but the elements of the Indian position is something that would not have come as a surprise to the Russians. Now, what impact it would have? Of course, this is India's position. We are not a direct belligerent or a party to the conflict. I don't think there's an expectation that India would be a mediator as yet. The war is progressing, in a sense, in a stalemated way. It is still sort of trudging along. My view is that at some stage the war will peter out. It'll be an incomplete victory for Russia and an incomplete defeat for Ukraine, as if you go by current accounts. And finally, not only the parties directly concerned, which is Russia and Ukraine, will have to take that into account, but also the countries which have been supporting this in one way or the other, the United States, NATO, and things like that. So, the war will end with neither side getting fully what they wanted. And that is the essence of compromise. And compromise will come, and we are heralding the fact that compromise is needed at the negotiating table. So I don't think we are central to the Ukraine peace process, but if you ask what is India's position has been fairly consistent, and we've said the same thing to everyone, to the Russians, to the Americans, to the Europeans. The Russians heard us, the Europeans don't hear us. Europe and the United States still supply a huge amount of weaponry to Ukraine. Of course, they have their own justification for that in terms of protection of Ukrainian interests. But Ukrainians themselves need to understand, what is it that they have done with 30 years of their independence? Where have they come to? And the policies that they have pursued, has it really sort of protected their interests? Now, this is not a question that can be answered by other countries. It is for the Ukrainians themselves to answer. And once they have a view which is different from their current view, which is to pursue the war until their entire territory has been vacated by Russia, which is their current view, whether it changes into another view where they are ready for a compromise will depend on their own calculations, and I think we should respect their own calculations. But their calculations will be impacted by the support that they get from the United States and Europe. And that, as we see it, is changing. It is not changed enough for making a direct impact on the war situation, but it's changing. It is also linked to the electoral process in the United States, and we'll see where where that goes. So this is a moving picture. It will change towards the end of the year or perhaps late in the year. While this is changing, I think India has positioned itself rather well, and we'll see where it goes from there.
Thank you. Raghavan, would you like to add on Ukraine?
Yeah. You know, what the Prime Minister said to Putin about rephrasing of what he had said earlier, that this is not the era of war and that the solution is not on the battlefield. You see, he mentioned that this had been discussed with Putin the previous day. And though all our TV channels have only showed what the Prime Minister said at that meeting, Putin actually started the conversation at the same meeting. And if you look at the Kremlin website, Putin actually said that we have discussed the issue of Ukraine in the meeting yesterday. And I am grateful to the Indian Prime Minister for having shown such interests and for having explored various options for a settlement by peaceful method. So you know, it's not as if PM said something and sort of as a public rebuke to Putin as it has been put in various... So this is something that I think was expected, and both of them have talked about it. To the larger issue of a settlement, I'm fully with Venkat that we are in no position today to mediate an end to the war. And secondly, who is this war between? It may be a war between Russia and Ukraine, but effectively it's a war between Russia and NATO. Without Western economic assistance, without Western arms, Ukraine would have folded up long back. And without the presence of, in fact, NATO advisors within Europe to continue to bolster Ukraine's defenses. So, you can't mediate between Russia and Ukraine when the war is between Russia and the West. And secondly, where is this question of, Russia and the West are actually, Russia and US in particular, have various channels of communication, and those channels of communication remain open. So it's not as if they don't know how to talk, it's not as if they don't know how to reach peace. It is both sides have climbed a tiger, and they don't know how to get off it. When a way is finally found for one to fall off the tiger, or both to get off their respective tigers, you will get to some kind of a settlement. And I fully agree with what Venkat is saying. You have reached a stage where actually no one can claim victory in any kind of believable way. So this will carry on until one or the other finds, or unless a method is found outside of the battlefield to make some kind of a settlement. And as far as we are concerned, of course, sooner that happens, the better.
Incidentally, there is also the question of the Indian helpers, as they're called. I would really think that they're more like mercenaries who go to fight in the war on Russia's side. I realize that that's been resolved because I think that was one of the issues discussed and resolved, that Putin has agreed that whoever among the Indians, they can come back. And of course, this feeds into the larger question of, without job opportunities in India, why do our people volunteer for these terrible jobs? And the answer is simple, it's economics. Apparently, they were prepared to pay 1.3 crores to each person's family if that person was killed during the conflict. And essentially, like, why do people go to the Gulf? Why do people go to migrate in search of better economic opportunities? It all ties into the same question, which is a larger question and a debate for another time. But I think it's a good achievement that it has been agreed that Indians can be sent back. Now it remains to be seen how many of them want to go back. And will they actually take up this offer? Will Russia decide that this is going to be a lingering issue, so it's better to send them all back? Or will they be asked, are you willing to stay? I'm not sure under what terms that was negotiated. Do either of you have an idea?
Ma'am, there's a lot of Indian workers who are filling the gap that have emerged in Russia, not just in Russia, but in Central Asia and other places. Because, like in Europe, Russia also has a big demographic shortfall. There's a big gap. Now, the Russian workforce that was there has been, in a sense, diverted into the industrial and the defense industry, because there's been a big boom in that place. Now, whether the Indians were recruited for non-combat duties or combat duties is something that is not clear. But whether they were duped into or tricked into signing on, I think the issue was that they signed on to a thing, and discharge from military service after you've signed on requires a procedure. Now, what I think at Prime Minister's request, I think what President Putin has said is that we will expedite this procedure specifically for the Indian things. But then it leaves the larger question. I mean, this is about these 30, 40 people that we're talking about. But it leaves the larger question that this is not the full number. And there are, in fact, thousands in Russia in other activities, which is construction, in agriculture, in textile industry. So it's part of a larger thing. So I think it is good that Prime Minister took it up very clearly with President Putin, and the Russians should put a stop of recruiting Indians. But that is at that end. But we should also be careful in putting an end to migration of this illegal migration, in a sense, of undocumented workers, a problem that we used to face once upon a time in the Gulf, which was finally sorted out. It doesn't happen in Central Asia and in Russia.
That's interesting. So it's not just confined to Russia, you have it in Central Asia as well. And Raghavan, any point you want to make on that?
No. It's just that the numbers which we are talking about, as he said, in the military, are a very limited, very small number. You're talking about, I think, under 50, as far as anybody knows. So I mean, it made for good copy, for good TV copy, but it's actually a small number. And for the rest, yes, I mean, this kind of activity is not restricted to Russia. It is there in Central Asia and also parts of Europe. And there are these pimps who are actually recruiting people and taking them there with the connivance of the authorities, and in large parts of Europe as well.
I agree. We've had a huge problem with agricultural workers in Italy, for example, and in Germany, all over Europe, really. And I had to deal with partially with this in Portugal when I was there, because they head for the countries where they feel there are soft immigration laws and anyway better conditions than what they would find in India. But as I said, that's a different topic. Now, I wanted to move on to the China-Russia relations issue. I think that's something on which they would be interested in hearing your views. And India's own reactions and India's own apprehensions when it comes to a close relationship that's developed between these two countries. It's not new. I mean, they've always recognized each other as two, basically communist governments. But apart from that, do you see trends that show that this is something of concern to us in India? And if so, has this been addressed at all in the discussions?
The fact of the matter is that China is a gigantic power, not today. And every part of the world has some sort of engagement with China, which is fairly substantial. So just to point out that countries have an engagement with China is a factor that is inimical to us, is, I think, a rudimentary way of looking at it. If you look at the figures, Russia's trade with China is about $200 billion. Russia, the trade balance is in favor of Russia, about $30 billion odd. In the United States, trade with China is about $750 billion. If you put EU along with the United States, the total trade is about $1.2 trillion. ASEAN trade with China is $1 trillion. Now, if we use just trade as an indicator of how countries deal with China as an indicator of how they will deal with us, that's not a path that we can go down. Our own trade with China is about $130 odd billion. And that is in China's favor, $100 billion in China's favor. Now, why has there been a huge jump in Russia-China trade? Largely on account of the fact that Western sanctions have eliminated or blocked and eliminated Western markets for traditional Russian exports, which is energy, commodities, and agriculture. So on the rebound, the Russians have sought other markets. And the most attractive market, of course, is China. I mean, it's a market that is larger than ours. But it is also a market that is connected. They share a land border, so these markets are. But Russia is not interested in having a dependency relationship with China, unless, of course, it is defeated and is a weak power and it has been defeated in war and it has no other option but to become a vassal of China, which is clearly not the case. If anything, the Russians are prevailing in Europe. Now, the key question for us is, does this increased relationship between Russia and China, not just in the economic and trade spheres and the energy sector, but in the larger coordination that they're doing at the political level and also somewhat in the military level, does it create leverage for China with Russia to impact on its relations with India? That, of course, is a key question, and I think we should monitor that very carefully. The evidence is not there to say that this has reached a critical stage where the Russia-China relationship becomes a key factor, a key negative factor in the Russia-India relationship. Now, if we were to briefly put ourselves in the Russian shoes, is it in Russia's interest to have an Asia dominated by just one country, China? The Russians answered that question in 1962 when they thought that leaving Asia at the mercy of the Chinese is not such a good idea, and they need India to do that. That has been one of the pillars of our relationship. On the other hand, this unending confrontation between Russia and the United States gives added opportunity for China. And that is something that we should take up with Russia, but it is also something that we should take up with the United States. Because why is it that their confrontation is leading in such a direction where, lastly, I think we misrepresent the India-Russia relationship as a dependency where they can turn off the switch and we would fall flat on our feet. That's not just not the case. We have a very strong relationship with Russia. 60-70% of our is of Russian origin. Origin doesn't mean a dependency, a continuing dependency. So our armed forces are well stocked. We have a relationship in terms of servicing and spares and things like that. But it doesn't paralyze us if the Russians were, in the very unlikely event, take a view that. But on critical factors for us, the Russians have always stood by us. You know, Russia is the only P5 country to say that Jammu and Kashmir is an integral part of India. You know, we tend to take that for granted. You know, the support has been so consistent, so traditional, that we almost take it for granted. On Article 370, the Russians said, you know, Article 370 is an internal matter of India. Jammu and Kashmir it belongs to you. Which Western country has said that? I mean, you know, very few who give us that sort of support. Now, if there were to be a conflict between India and China, of course, it is a matter not only between India and Russia, but it is also a matter between India and the United States and vice versa, because it is a global issue. And the best solution to that is not to test it. I mean, you know, why do we want to test the strength of the India-Russia relationship on the anvil of exaggerated or heightened tensions with China? I mean, you know, don't push your luck, I would say.
Thank you. Raghavan?
Yeah, you know, right. Russia-China is a very complex relationship. But on one plane, it is quite obvious that they have to have a close partnership. They've got a 4,000-kilometer border. They have got complementarities. There are economic complementarities, technological complementarities, raw material energy requirement. So a certain level of partnership at a high level is, I think, expected, in spite of the fact that they've had a history of rivalry, they've had a history of conflict, all that is there. I think the issue really is, in fact, you know, the person who put it best of all was President Biden of the United States after he met Putin in June 2021, where he said that Putin feels that we are applying pressure on him, and because of that, he is being strangled by China. So, essentially, if the more the tensions with the West rise, the more the Russians have to depend on China for economic support, which is to ward off the impact of sanctions, and political support in the United Nations and elsewhere as they combat the hostility of the West. So the concerns about what Venkat said, the concerns about Russia's dependency on China going to the extent that it will make Russia take decisions inimical to India, that is the concern. But once again, as he said rightly, we have not reached there. The evidence so far, Russia is certainly able to stand up to China on matters relating to India. If you recall, in 2020, when the Galwan standoff took place, our defense minister went to Russia. And he came back and said the Russians have assured us of not only the continuity of supplies, but that some of it will be fast-tracked. And there were, in fact, quite angry comments in the Chinese press that, you know, our strategic partner is supplying something to our adversary and is not sort of heeding our concerns. So, effectively, Putin, as I think he mentioned, you know, he also wants to make Russia great again. He doesn't want to succumb if he doesn't have to succumb. So, until such stage as Russia can stand up to China on India, and the point is that, you know, you lose India. This is what is happening today. The Americans want India because they don't want to lose India to Russia or to China. So American policy, in fact, today has been to make sure tensions between India and China continue, and to make sure that they can, and to try to wean India away from Russia. So it's you know, everybody is playing this game. And there's no reason why Russia should voluntarily give up its ambitions to maintain a certain level of independence and then to, as I said, to eventually become a great power again. So we need to look at Russia. At the same time, we do need to closely monitor the military technologies that Russia is transferring to China. Some of the reserve that was there in earlier times has gone because of this dependence that they have. There is a lot of intelligence and space surveillance cooperation between Russia and China. We need to keep Russia online with us. We also need to make sure that Russia's interest in us continues, such that the motivation not to act against our interest remains. And that's certainly one of the underlying subtexts of the Prime Minister's visit to Russia, to maintain also Russia's interest in us. And of course, you have this entire region, you have the Central Asian region, which is actually Russia and China lord it over. You don't want to be not present there. You want to be present in the dynamics of that region, and you want to keep Russia on side in that. So these are all the things that we need to do to try to see that Russia-China relations do not act against us. And another point that he mentioned, I think we need to be telling the Americans more often that, by leaning on Russia, you are actually hurting your own interests, because you need to focus on China, which is your main adversary.
Thank you. Now, turning finally to the joint statement. The joint statement, as we've seen, is 10 pages long. It's 81 paragraphs. And I see most of them as fairly anodyne and the usual stuff that is said in joint statements. Motherhood statements, correct. So, but the one thing I found interesting was the $100 billion target that has been set for India-Russia trade. What is the present trade, and do you think this is an achievable target in the short term? Venkatesh?
Ma'am, there are two sorts of relations that India has. One is where the joint statement is the ceiling, and one where the joint statement is the floor. In India-Russia relations, joint statement is the floor. There's much more relationship beyond the joint statement.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, I think what the main thrust of the joint statement is to identify areas of cooperation which will be the new drivers of our relationship in the next decade or so. And they've set a target of $100 billion, which I think is very easily achievable. The present trade is around $67, $68 billion. 63 or 64 of it is energy cooperation. But I think if we transition this from a trading relationship into an investment relationship and a joint venture relationship and add more items into the basket, which is fertilizers, coking coal, if the transport corridors, with the North-South corridor through Iran and to the Caspian Sea and the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor are also operationalized, all these additional costs come down. Actually, you will be plugging into a very good relationship with... of course, the problem here is that the trade deficit, which I think these new items will help us. But I think the important point there also is that we are trying to see whether we can connect our young generation, our new technologies. There's a huge amount of talent in India, I'm sure in the city itself, Bangalore. But there's a huge amount of talent in Russia. I mean, just like we are, our young kids and young generation is absolutely top class in the new technologies and their applications. And it's the same with Russia. And, and it's no wonder that many Indians and many Russians are part of the revolution that takes place in the United States and Europe. I mean, so these new drivers, it's not just we deal with our old traditional areas of cooperation. And I think going forward, this is something that I want to leave with our young friends here who've joined us in this meeting. Russia is not all war and oil and things like that. There's a very vibrant young generation that has grown up in the last 30 years, very talented. They're obviously always very good at maths and physics and stuff like that. And they are not very dissimilar to what our young generation is here. So I think I would encourage you to look at Russia in its more holistic way of dealing with people and educational institutions and their institutes and their companies and things like that. So I'll end there.
Raghavan, would you like to say something on the joint statement?
Firstly, on the last point, we only know the Russia of CNN, which is not Russia. So that's an important point to remember. And Putin is not Gabbar Singh. That's also another point worth remembering. Look back to this is a digression, but look back once again to the press conference that Joe Biden gave in June 2021. In those days, he was giving press conferences, by the way. And he talked about Putin, and you should really read, those of you who are interested should go back and read what he said about Putin. He said he's a nationalist, he's a man who has his country's national interests at heart, that is the reason why I can do business with him. So it's very different from what they're all saying about Putin today. So, these are, one should not get into the fall prey to propaganda without recognizing that there is another side to it. Now, about the joint statement, I fully agree with what he said. The joint statement actually just makes the point that we are continuing to engage with Russia in a number of areas, and there are a whole lot of areas of cooperation which are not in the joint statement. About the trade, the two problems about the trade today, one is the payment mechanisms. Payment mechanisms have still not been sorted out. They've been sorted out on a case-by-case basis for oil. Now you know how to pay for it, but it's not the same methodology that you use for other trade. And I know I've experienced this problem when you try to get things across from the north-south, through Iran, that is. You face all kinds of issues with customs and payments and so on, which is actually hampering the trade. I agree that this Chennai-Vladivostok corridor can be a major driver of trade because there is a huge natural resources in the Russian Far East which can be transported economically through this. So if we can get these transport corridors going, if you can get this north-south transport corridor, or at least the logistical arrangements for transit through Iran, which, by the way, is mentioned in the joint statement as one of the things that they're doing, I think we can increase. In fact, according to estimates, in Eurasian region alone, which is basically Central Asia, if the north-south transport corridor is activated, the trade can increase from what is now about $15 billion or so to something like $180 billion. And you can imagine this north-south transport corridor, by the way, not only connects Russia, it also, through Russia, connects Europe. And at some point of time, eventually this trade has to start resuming between Russia and Europe again. So there are very many opportunities there.
I think on this optimistic note, I think we're going to close the panel discussion, but we do have about nearly 20 minutes left for questions. So we'd be happy to take questions from the audience. Please keep your questions brief, and do say whom on the panel they're addressed to. So I'll open it up for questions. Yes, the young man here.
Yeah, probably should. Sorry, no pressure. Hi. Sorry, I forgot your name. The one in the middle.
Mr. Raghavan.
Mr. Raghavan.
Yeah.
You can't ever forget it. It's the middleman.
All right. My question is addressed to you, Mr. Raghavan, sir. Modi and Putin were talking about nuclear reactors and some form of nuclear cooperation between India and Russia. And I read one Bloomberg article about Russia supplying nuclear uranium ore to India. I'm not sure the details, but with this nuclear cooperation, so to speak, do you think it's a fine point that could be overlooked in India-Russia relations, or do you think there's some deeper geopolitical significance to it? Thank you.
Yeah.
No, India-Russia cooperation in nuclear energy has a long history. It's not something new. What they talked about, and I think it's mentioned in the joint statement, is that you will continue the cooperation in nuclear energy. In fact, we have already an agreement with Russia for 6 nuclear power plants, 1,000 megawatts, in Kudankulam in Tamil Nadu, of which 2 are already operating. They're under operation. We're all getting power from that in Bangalore. And 4 more are at various stages of construction. Now, there is an agreement for more power plants to come up. There is still an argument about where they will be sited and, location of land for power plants. Nuclear power plants is not easy in India either. Anyway, so that is the nuclear energy cooperation with Russia. These are Russian technology reactors. There has been progressive increase in indigenization. The uranium for that comes from Russia, and this started at a time when it was very valuable, when our civil nuclear cooperation agreement had not, or rather, the opening up of civil nuclear cooperation for India with foreign countries had not happened. The Russians were giving us uranium for the full life cycle of the plant. And that is an agreement that continues. So this is an ongoing cooperation which is very successful, and one of the various elements of India-Russia energy cooperation. We also have hydrocarbon investments in Russia. I mean, something in the region of $15 to $20 billion investment of Indian hydrocarbon companies in in Siberia, basically.
I think Kudankulam is a good example of that.
Kudankulam is
the main one, and there are remaining units to be constructed there as well. Any other question? Oh, many. I think your hand went up first. Yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Actually, what you can do is you can club 2 or 3 questions together.
That's a good idea. Why don't we do that, since we don't have much time? We'll take 2 or 3 questions together. Go ahead, please.
And one or the other of us.
Can you stand up, please? I can't see you. Yeah. And most of us, as we get older, we do a little bit of lip reading as well as looking at you. So. Yeah.
I was just taking notes on yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to use the point that Ambassador Verma made about the lack of awareness in India about Russian culture, more broadly speaking, or what's going on there, and open it up into a question to you about the complications of foreign policy and diplomacy in a democracy. So given that we are a country with a very young population, and most people here might not even remember the USSR or relationships and so on, given that people keep changing their opinions, given that so much of Indian politics is
Can we get to the question, yes, please? Yeah.
Given that it's driven by domestic interest, how do you ensure some level of continuity on foreign policy issues, on issues like this that are truly generation spanning?
Yeah. Next question. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll keep it short as well. So,
Yeah.
not as short as this maybe. But the question is, while we play out these neighborhood battles between US, Russia, China, India, you have this huge problem of climate change. It's like those 2 deers fighting and the lion running across, and they don't see the lion coming. Where do you see scope for, a cooperation there, where you have this existential problem? And I like Sir's point on, I'm sorry, I'm just adding another question. I like Sir's point when he said that you need power to change the world order. Point is, like, a good amount of the last world order was defined by oil and energy. And now as more people switch to clean energy and those dependencies go away, how do relationships get restructured?
Thank you. Thank you. Would you like to take that?
We'll take another one.
One more. There. Sorry, you already have the mic.
I
Yeah.
have been to Russia and Ukraine in the 80s, and so also Cuba. My question is addressed to Mr. Raghav. It's none of those countries have enough stuff to woo the interests of typical Indian tourists, or anything else to
Hold up the mic, please, to your mouth.
nothing to woo the interests of typical Indian tourists, and so also the Indian students over there. Of course, once you go there, the universities or the libraries and all that are enriched, and the people are very, very proactive, friendly, not only with Indians, with even Western Europeans, some of my colleagues. But it's not good enough to draw the attention of the people to go and travel to explore Russia or other countries, because Mr. Raghav was mentioning that Russia, as shown by CNN or the general media, is different from the reality. But when I visited there also, it was more like cognac is Vignac, and in Cuba, the best Havana Club rum and all that is beautiful. But rest of the things are very, very, very difficult to kind of navigate through, to enjoy these countries.
Which year did you say you were talking about?
Sorry?
When did you say you
It was in the 80s, between 1980 and 80.
Totally different, totally different.
87. After that, I went to US to study. So.
Okay. You can take these three questions, I think, to begin with,
Okay.
and then we'll go there. Anyone on this side? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is actually a bit lighthearted one. It's directed to all of you. With such long and illustrious careers, I would like all of you to, if possible, share a few anecdotes of your negotiations with the Russians, any interesting stuff you have to share, or were they very hard negotiators, something which we are not aware of, what goes on behind.
I think we'll do this offline. We won't do this on the record. I have some funny stories. I'm sure so do Venkat and Raghavan. Go ahead, please. Who else on this side? This one.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions addressed to the panel, so please do to answer.
Please hold the mic up to your mouth.
Yeah. So one question is about this notion of new directions for India-Russia relations, right? And this topic of economics and trade came a lot. So we also read in the news that there is a current trade deficit because we are trading energy in Indian rupees. So how do we balance, try to close that gap so that there could be Russian investments in India? And the second was about this discussion on Russia's concerns, will it have increased dependency on China? So where does Russia see India playing a role in balancing out Russia's hegemony?
Thank you. Who is the next? Yeah, the lady at the back.
They can't remember all the questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, ma'am.
I have
Am I
forgotten the
audible?
first one.
Go ahead.
Yes. So this question is addressed to Sir Raghavan. Sir, you had mentioned that India is not in any position to mediate in the Russia-Ukraine war. But why is it that NATO is so much involved and has been a keen observer in the recent bilateral summit between India and Russia? And why is it that after that NATO is agreeing to supply arms to Ukraine? So that's my question.
Yeah, go ahead. We'll take these two to begin with. Raghavan?
Do you want to start?
Well, you see, for those who have dealt with foreign affairs in a professional sort of way, I mean, of course, your effort and your access to information is a little more elaborate. But for an informed citizen, such as yours, I mean, you do other stuff, but you have a genuine active interest in international affairs. I think it is very essential, especially of our young generation in India, because India itself will be very globalized. We'll have a lot to do with the world. So it's very important for us to understand the world from our own eyes. And part of the globalization that has taken place, globalization is at various levels. But you see the informational globalization, where actual Western dominance is almost 100%. In no other field is Western dominance so powerful. Or the next, you would say Western dominance is very powerful in banking. But banking also now slowly we are sort of moving away from. But in information, it is 100%. You open the 3 or 4, 5, 6 English language newspapers in our country. I don't know about Deccan Herald here, but and you see the coverage on the Ukraine war. Firstly, none of these newspapers have sent correspondents to. They don't have foreign correspondents. Very few of them have foreign correspondents. So they cut and paste the 3 news agencies that put out news stories: AFP, AP, and Reuters. And if you read the news stories of these 3 agencies, Russia lost the war thrice in 2021. President Putin fell off the stairs 2 times in 2023. You know, Russia is about to collapse in 2024. You know, it's 100% not true. That has taken a big hit.
Russian equipment has been completely battered in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, you know, and the thing goes on. But there's a parallel revolution that is taking place. You can replicate that on CNN, on BBC, on Deutsche Welle, you know, it's broadly the same thing. But a parallel revolution is taking place, which is the democratization of information on the social media, which is a huge revolution. Now, a lot of that is also infiltrated and disinformation is fed into that. So we are not short of information in the present world. And if you go onto the net, there's so much of information that is possible. But I think it is important to develop a very healthy skepticism along with your interest. And there's nothing like traveling abroad, meeting people, having an open mind, not being too judgmental about things, looking at indicators, looking at opinions of what foreigners say. I mean, you know, I think to make up our own mind, I think that is very, very important. And firstly, I think many of us should, first of all, realize that we are part of the information war. You know, we are the victims of the information war. And you see it in that context. I think then you become a little more aware and alert to. And it's not a way of saying, you know, it's only about Russia. It's how the international debate is framed, how opinions are brought forward. And opinions are brought forward and taken forward into articles. Articles become, then they become textbooks, they become lectures, you know. There's a whole mindset that is created. Now, if India were to, the young generation of Indians were to step out into the world, we cannot step out into the world to our benefit and with our self-respect intact if we step out into the world with other people's mindsets. You know, the first thing is to have our own mindset. It may not be complete, but it is something.
I think if we have to cover the other questions, we'll have to wind
Ma'am,
up.
the rest of the questions I've forgotten, so please.
I will answer 2 questions that I remember. I'll answer the last one first and then come to the gentleman who went to Russia in 1987. why was the world looking at Modi's visit so carefully, the Western world? Because they have created this narrative that Russia is isolated. They have created this narrative that, as I said, Putin is Gabbar Singh. They have created this narrative that, in this, you as democratic, world's biggest democracy, you visit Russia, you are puncturing Russia's political isolation. Now, this was a myth in the first place. Russia's political isolation doesn't extend much beyond the Western world. Putin was everyone highlights Putin's visit to North Korea, but he also went to Vietnam. He was given the red carpet in Vietnam. They don't mention it because America is also trying to woo Vietnam. He went to UAE and Saudi Arabia and really got a huge red carpet reception. There's a whole stream of non-Western leaders who are visiting Russia regularly. So one point was that you are puncturing Russia's political isolation. That's a myth because that political isolation was never there. Second point about mediation. When do you mediate? You mediate when you know what two sides of a particular dispute, what they want, what is their fallback position, and therefore where you can try to act as an honest broker. Also, you do mediation when the two sides are not talking to each other. Now here, as I said before, this is not a Russia-Ukraine war. Ukraine is merely a proxy. It is a war between Russia and NATO, and if you want to explain that, you need to go back right up to the end of the Cold War. How did this whole dispute begin? What were Russia's worries about NATO extending? What is the importance of Ukraine and Georgia, which is the other country, to Russia for its security? How did various machinations take place in order to lead to this situation where eventually the war started? And even from 2021, you can keep mapping this and see what happened. So, you know that this is a war which people have gone into with their eyes open. So this is not a situation where you go and try to mediate. There are enough people to do this. So India's voice, yes, India's voice was raised to say that, look, try to urge you to find peace. Try to say that I also represent the developing countries. We had a virtual summit of the Global South last year. And to convey the view that, we are all looking for peace. Your fighting for your European security architecture is actually hurting all of us. And about Russia,
yeah.
Please go back to Russia. That was the Soviet Union in 1987. I can tell you that Russia of today is very different. I went recently to Russia with a group with directors of a company where I'm also an independent director. All of them were visiting Russia for the first time. They could not stop talking about it. They went to Volgograd, they went to St. Petersburg, they went to Moscow, and it's now 3 weeks, and I continue to keep getting WhatsApp messages from them. Russia, when you go to Russia, you really know what it is about. And I'm sorry to say that Ukraine remains much the same as it was in 1987. Ukraine, after 1990, did not develop as it ought to have developed. Its economy stagnated. Corruption took over that country. And from the granary of Europe, from being the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, its per capita income fell below that of Albania. That's where Ukraine was before this war started. Of course, it's in much worse shape today.
I think much though I would love to continue the dialogue with all of you, we'll have to bring this to a close because we are already past our 8 o'clock deadline. So thank you very much for being here, and please give a round of applause to our two amazing panelists.